So my name is Korah. I'm the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. For some of you who don't know me, I'm actually the replacement of Eva D'Agostini, who's been around for the longest time. It was really sad for me to see Eva go, huge shoes to fill. But at the same time, I'm really excited to be the coordinator, and I've got tons and tons of experience and stories and things to share with you. I've been working in the field, oh my goodness, since 2007. I've been in the field, worked both at elementary and high school. I also have a private practice and I work with parents. Eva and I have a similar training with the Neufeld material. And so I will be bringing that lens forward. And so that's staying with the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. I have a handout that I'm going to put right now into the chat. And maybe what I'll do, given that not everybody's here just yet, please let me know if you see the handout, and I'll post it again a bit later in the presentation to make sure that everybody gets it. It's still uploading, so just bear with me a moment. Shouldn't be too long. And actually, while this uploads, I think what I'm going to do quickly is I want to share screen and show you the website. So you have a sense. Oh, I just need to end show here because I'm going to show this afterwards. I wanted to show you quickly, for those who are not aware of the CEBM website. So the address is ceebm.ca. I'm going to put it into the chat. So it's www.ceebm.ca. This is the website. Okay, so you've got the PowerPoint. Wonderful. And on the website, wanted to show you quickly where, if you want more information on the Nurturing Support Center, on the second tab underneath projects, you click on Nurturing Support Center, and this will give you access to a page where we have a recording where you get to visit 2 different Nurturing Support Centers. They're at the elementary level in this recording, but I invite you to go and take a look. And then we have just a quick 1-pager descriptor of what a Nurturing Support Center is. We have a more lengthy document for the elementary and one right here for the high school. And this is just a document with additional guidelines and materials that we suggested that can be purchased to put into the Nurturing Support Center. And then you have pictures here, pictures for the elementary and high school. So I will stop sharing that and to start my PowerPoint. So just bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to set it up. All right. And I'm going to share a screen. Voila. All right. So every time that I've been presenting in the last year, I've been using a similar format that instead of jumping directly into what it is that I want to propose or suggest or as a resource or material, I start off not with the what, but with the why. So why is it that it is important to consider a Nurturing Support Center in your school, to set one up in your school? We're going to start there. And then after, I'm going to walk through, so how do we go about this process? And then we're going to look more concretely of what a Nurturing Support Center looks like. And so if we were to begin with the why, one of the things that's been, a realization, not just recently, but, over the years, I think every year with certain students, this is a reality, that although, teachers and support staff and administration have the best intentions, and we've got a wonderful curriculum, we've got technology to support, we try to put in place all of these great initiatives with fun, types of activities and mediums and so forth. For some students, unfortunately, the teaching doesn't always result into learning despite our best efforts. And we're really talking about a handful of students. And so, of course, this is not that for the majority of students, and for some that do struggle, but that if we put certain measures in place, They're still able to function in the classroom, but students that would benefit from a nurturing support center is really that top tier 3, few students for whom no matter what we put in place, oh my goodness, the struggles that they have to be in class every day, all day. And you know who are those students I'm talking about? The students that can't sit still at their desk, that walk around and come up with all sorts of reasons to need to walk around in the classroom. Those students that can't focus on their work, that disrupt the class, that disrupt the teaching. Students who get emotional, that have big emotions, can get explosive. Or at the other end of the continuum, students that are shut down. And although they're in the classroom and not disturbing, they're really not that available. So their body's there, but their mind isn't. And so what do we do with these students that are struggling on a regular basis? And is the classroom, you know, in the way that it's set up right now, is that the best way to be able to support them to learn? And so the drama with these stuck students is the tragedy that kind of goes in 3 acts, where on the first act, you've got the student who's stuck because of emotional problems, or stuck because of past trauma, or stuck because they have hypersensitivities that are distracting them, and so forth. And you know, adults that are there and well-meaning, when they pick up on this, when they pick up on the fact that the student is stuck, the good intentions of the adult initially is to start pushing, to try to get the student to focus, to try to get the student to sit down, to try for the student to calm down, and so forth. And for some students, you know, being able to give them that extra attention works. But for few students, it really is actually does the opposite perverse reaction, where when the students feel pushed, now what happens is they start putting on the brakes. And when the adults are feeling resisted, the more they're being resisted, the more they're being persistent in their approach to make it work. And so what I'm hoping to walk through with you today in this hour presentation that we have is to be able to shift our lens and to perhaps see these students from a different angle. And the way that we will see these students will inform us not only on the foundational struggles that they're going through, but also will give us cues on what are the better interventions to put in place to make a difference, where it really helps them, it really benefits their growth, and at the same time, where it minimizes the triggering of the student, and that it could potentially make things worse. I mean, how often we've tried with students to put in place these behavior management systems for them to gain rewards, or for them to have consequences because they're not following through with something. And yet we continue to put in these systems, and it just doesn't seem to work with those students. And so in order to help you shift your lens, we're going to be looking at some material today that fits into 4 different realms or theories or approaches in terms of helping shift your lens. And so the first one is the attachment-based developmental approach. Gordon Neufeld is part of that, of course, but there's many other authors in the last years that have been coming forward with their own material that is attachment friendly and that is developmentally based. Mona de la Hook is a wonderful author who's written Beyond Behaviors. I love her, she's terrific. Deborah McNamara, Hannah Beach. These are authors that come out of the Neufeld Institute, but also have their own books. And so this is the first lens. Excuse me. The second one is anything that's coming out of neuroscience in terms of the brain research and understanding the impact of the brain and the impact of the brain onto the emotions, and how emotions impact behavior, and how that has an impact on the classroom as a whole and on our teaching. And so some of the popular researchers out there, Jay Geed is one, Stephen Porges is another. There's a lot of great material in the last couple of years coming out on understanding how emotions have an impact on behavior and where this plays out in the brain, and how to understand also maturation and in terms of self-regulation, and that doesn't happen right away, and so forth. And so that's another lens. The third one is in terms of trauma research. And so Bruce Perry is a huge one, Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk. There's so much material coming out of the trauma because of course, many of the students that we work with, although we may not be aware of some of their traumatic history, really does have an impact on a daily basis on their capacity to be receptive and to learn in the classroom. And the last portion that we're going to be kind of focusing on a little bit here, and this is more recent research, but all of the research behind play and the benefits of play on brain development, on learning. And so Jack Panksepp is a huge author in this field. Peter Gray is another one, David Elkind, and so forth. And so these are the four kind of lens I want you to keep in mind as we're going to be discussing the Nurturing Support Center in potentially putting this in place in your school. And so really quickly kind of looking at the maturation principle and understanding that students don't, although grow older, don't grow up automatically. It requires good conditions. They need to have these stable, supportive homes in order to feel safe enough to then put their brain to put focus on the growth of the brain rather than being in survival mode. And so if you look at just the natural progression of brain development in a child who is neurotypical in a healthy living environment, it's not before the beginning of the age 5 to 7 that there starts being a little bit of prefrontal cortex development. And so you could see here at the age of 12 that there's a bit more progression happening there. At 16, there's much more. And of course, in the 20s, much more. But for those who work at the elementary level, for those who work with K4, K5, there is not enough brain development in order for them to be able to manage their emotions and to control their behavior. It's just not there yet. We need to give it time, to give it space in order to grow. And even those that are working with children at the high school level, you know, like I mentioned, it requires good conditions, good living conditions in order to put your brain at rest and to focus on growth. Growth is a luxury to the brain. If the brain is hijacked by survival, there is no growth happening. And so you could have a 16-year-old in age, and yet their brain not look like this. You could have a 16-year-old for whom their brain looks more like an 8-year-old. We have adults, for that matter, that have not had the luxury of growing up because of unfortunate life situations. And these are the students that are in our classrooms, in our hallways, in our building, and that we're meant to support and to work with. And there's nothing that we can teach. There's nothing that we can force. The only thing that can help this move along is for them to feel safe enough, long enough, that their brain can focus on growth. Now, please know that even if a child has had hardships and trauma in their young childhood, this doesn't mean that their brain will never grow. It just needs to have, in that present moment, the right conditions. And even if a child has a difficult home life, this doesn't mean that we cannot offer them that safe place at school. So of course, if you have a very immature child that you're working with, they have a really hard time finding information efficiently and quickly in their brain because they do have an underdeveloped cerebellum. They do also have a hard time seeing the whole picture, having perspective, and that's because they have an underdeveloped corpus callosum. Also, they have a hard time tempering, and another term for tempering is self-regulation. So they have a hard time regulating their emotions. Their emotions are on full course without filter because they have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. And so even though, as we're talking to them when they're calm, they may seem like they know better, as soon as they're triggered and that they're emotional, they cannot do better because their emotions are being overwhelmed. They overwhelm reason, they flood the brain. And so what happens in that moment is that the student is very impulsive and behavior takes over. And so understanding that the difference between an immature individual and a mature individual is the impact of the prefrontal cortex especially. And so of course, adults have impulses just like children, The difference between a mature adult and an immature child is the fact that even though they have impulses, they have the prefrontal cortex that helps to kind of slow things down, to be able to give perspective, that even though you want perhaps to do something, that you talk yourself out of it or through it in order to kind of not kind of let impulses take over. So this is the whole piece in terms of the maturity section. Now, the other piece that we really need to consider as well is the whole vulnerability factor. And I mentioned before that if the brain is in survival mode and that it's hijacked by stress, then there's no place for growth. The other piece that you need to know is that if the child has defenses, has an armor to protect themselves, then there is no room for them to take risks and to make mistakes and to allow themselves to be vulnerable and to share their fears and thoughts and so forth, because they're not feeling comfortable being in their vulnerability and put up these walls to protect themselves. And so depending on if there's overwhelming sensitivities, we can think about our gifted children or children on the spectrum or children who just have, sensory issues. This really plays into the putting up the defenses to protect themselves because their brain is being flooded by this overstimulation. Same thing if there's a history of trauma. Some of the children who go through hardships that some adults never in their life will even imagine going through. Some of these kids, how sad some of their stories are. And so, of course, what ends up happening is that they put forth an armor to protect themselves, and for good reason, because if they don't, then all what it does is push their buttons left, right, and center with all of this overwhelming emotional experience. But the unfortunate piece is that once they're shut down, not only are they shut down on an emotional level, they're shut down on many other levels, including building relationships with adults, including being open to new learning, because new learning can be quite vulnerable. And so for those hypersensitive children, and I mentioned before, gifted children, children that are on the autism spectrum, or children, and I'm saying children, but please hear me, it's also adolescents, and students that have high emotional intensity, like gifted kids, they get very easily affected by their emotions. They get overwhelmed by those emotions. They also oftentimes stay stuck there because they put up those defenses to protect themselves. The other piece that plays into it is not just how the emotions overwhelm and impact the child, but also the adults that are working with the child who are themselves getting destabilized by the degree of reaction from the student in question. Their instinct is to want to kind of contain things and to be able to calm the child and to be able to make them happy. And unfortunately, when we're in the fix-it mode, then we're not giving it space in order to release, giving it space in order to work itself out, in order for the child and adolescent to grow from that experience. And so in terms of the sensory, for some of these children on the spectrum, one of the pieces that really plays into it, on top of the fact that there's a huge flooding in the system and there's a sensory kind of overload, they also have an impairment in what we call the sensory gating system. And so at the stem of the brain, if I were to show just for a second here an image of the brain, so you've got an image of the brain here, and just at the stem of it, which is where all of the senses are taken in. And not just the five senses from the outside world, but also the inner senses, those that might have OT experience. We know that interoception and proprioception are also inner world sensory experiences. And so for an individual who's neurotypical, they have a good filtering system and they're able to block out the noise. And so they can manage the flow of input that is coming to their brain. However, an individual who has an impaired sensory gating system, it's kind of like, if we were to compare it to something, it's like as if their filter has holes in it. And so instead of being able to well filter out the noise, it's like as if it's coming into waves into the system. And so you can imagine a child or an adolescent on a daily basis, from the time they wake up in the morning to the time they go to bed at night, the overstimulation, the extra input that their brain is experiencing, and how that has an impact on the stress level of the individual, on how their emotions are being experienced, and in turn how the behavior comes out. And so children that are on that continuum really struggle in terms of just being able to sit there and to focus in class, because they have so many other things that are happening in their bodies. Similarly, in a different way, but similarly, children who have gone through adverse childhood experiences, so they've had past of trauma, really has a huge impact on the brain. And so on the left-hand side here, you have a picture of a healthy child who has gone through a good, stable home life. And so you could see how the brain has good, what's the word, neural functioning. All of the sections are lighting up. If there is upset, there's capacity in the prefrontal cortex to be able to temper it and so forth. And so you could see the activities working well in the brain here on the left-hand side. Compared to the brain here on the right-hand side, where this is a child since birth who has been severely neglected. This is an orphan, a Romanian orphan that after years of not having the necessary support, that has had some emotional neglect and abuse and so forth, you can see the true impact that it has on the brain, how some of the neurons don't even light up. And so because the brain was kind of so focused and overwhelmed by survival, that it did not have the chance to focus on growth. And so even though this is not something that we can see to the naked eye, these are things that we can experience while we see our students struggling in the classroom, that instead of being able to focus on the lesson at hand, all they're doing is scanning the room to make sure they're safe. And so this has an impact on the capacity for the student to be attentive to the teacher, to be able to be successful in their learning and so forth. And so all of this has an impact. The amygdala, that is the center of the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, oftentimes for traumatized children have an overactivated amygdala. And so the second that a child is impacted by stress, it almost does like a 0 to 10 type of reaction. It's instant and exponential. And so the double handicap that has the effects of adverse childhood experiences are kind of double-fold, where on the one hand, you've got the amygdala that is decalibrated and overly sensitive and reacts very quickly to very little stress. Also, the prefrontal cortex, and you can see here clearly in this picture, is compromised. You can see that there's not as much activation happening in the prefrontal cortex compared to this child here on the left. And so because the prefrontal cortex is compromised, then the child at hand doesn't have the capacity to be able to temper the amygdala that's all over the place. And so you can imagine that child who's gone through trauma in your classroom, that really their brain is not focused on cognitive capacity and integrative capacity. They're focused on danger in the environment to make sure they're safe, and on survival. And there are in their emotional and instinctual brain. And so if we were to look at it from another angle, and so this chart looks at from left to right, you've got the daily challenge happening in a child's life, to moderate stress, to higher distress or threat that's happening in their life. And if we look from bottom to top, you've got here a state of calmness, to a state of alertness, to a state of alarm, to a state of fear, and to a state of terror. So if we take a neurotypical child who doesn't have necessarily any type of trauma, and so you could see how the up in stress in the body is quite proportionate to the degree of stress happening in the environment. And so the more stress that's happening in their daily surroundings, the more they're reacting to that. Compared to here on the left-hand side, and we call this a sensitized child. So this could be both a child who is either on the spectrum, hypersensitive, or it could be a child who's gone through trauma. We can see how quickly, just from daily challenges to moderate stress, how quickly their brain jumps from calmness to alertness to fear. And by the time they're in moderate stress, their brain is completely overflooded, and there's no capacity for that student in that moment to be available for learning or to be receptive to the adult. Their brain is so overwhelmed by their emotions and their sensory input that they are overtaken by that. And here on the right-hand side at the bottom here, we have a child for whom the resiliency has been built, where there has been some supports put in place, where there's been some experiences that have been, the student has been able to walk through in order to build their resiliency. And so you can see for that child here at the bottom that even though when things are very stressful, of course, they'll react to a similar degree than a neurotypical child. However, you could see the capacity to be able to manage and to cope from a daily challenge to moderate stress. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is the benefits of the Nurturing Support Center. If the Nurturing Support Center in a school can help students build their resiliency, that it can help students, give them a place and a time where they can find rest, where they are able to let out and express what's in their system, where they're able to feel safe and so forth, and to continue to work on building their resiliency, even if they are hypersensitive and have this history of trauma, chances are they will have a better capacity of coping once they're back into the classroom. And so if we were to look at it from another angle, the reason why students find themselves in learning and behavior problems is because at the foundation, there's a sensitivity overwhelm in their system. And because this is overwhelming, the body then moves to defend itself, to protect itself, which is normal and natural. But if it's continuously defended, then there is missing feelings in order to grow up, and they're also stuck. And so because they're stuck and they're overwhelmed, then it makes place for learning and behavior problems. And so what I'm hoping for is that we're able to reverse, and I'll show you the other slide in a second, but to be able to reverse the capacity that we will go from being able, oh, 1 second. Here we go. That from having a good relational support to the student now feeling safe and being able to soften their emotional defenses, that their emotions they're able to feel those emotions, that they do have a good, healthy development. This will result into good learning and good behavior. But as you can notice, we're not attacking, if I go back to the other slide, we're not attacking the learning and the behavior problems at the symptom level. We are reaching it more at the root. And so at the root, part of the idea here is, in thinking about the attachment principles, how can we set up a space and time with adults, safe adults, significant adults to the child, where they are able to have moments of rest, where they're able to recharge their battery, that they're able to be where they can release those emotions, where they feel welcome, where they feel safe, and so forth. And of course, in order for them to have a good relationship with the adults, they also need to have that good attachment, because attachment is actually the natural influence. It's only through a good attachment will students want to do our bidding, where students will want to please us, where students will want to follow our cues. This is not about the fact that we're a teacher or we're a principal. It's not about role. It's about relationship. And so a Nurturing Support Center can be a place, especially if students have a hard time trusting adults and are so explosive that there's no time or space for them to be able to build a relationship with the adults, that the Nurturing Support Center could be that space in order for them to build those relationships. And so what works is for those kids, just to kind of reiterate, is for them to be able to have a quite safe space with calming adults, with a calming environment, with predictability and structure, where there's a compassion approach. And it's not just about containing the kids for the sake of shutting them down and for the sake of them being happy and calm, is that we're going about it in a way where we're inviting for release, but we're also helping them in a compassionate way to find a way for them to come back to a place of rest and calm. And so ultimately, the way that behavior changes is not about attacking the behavior directly. It is more about looking at it from a foundational perspective. And so once a child is able to grow up and mature, then will the behavior change. When students are able to be in touch with their own emotions and to feel that vulnerability, then will behavior change. Once children have a good working attachment with the adults and that want to do their bidding, but also feel safe, then behavior will change. But only in those conditions can behavior change. So now we're going to move on to the next section in terms of the process, in terms of the Nurturing Support Center, what's behind the scenes of the Nurturing Support Center. And so part of it is the ideology, the philosophy that the adults that are running the space are meant to be gardeners, and being really intuitive about each child that has their own rhythm, that has their own growth, that are at different places in life, and that we're not there to tug and pull at their fruit and to push for them to be civilized just yet, that we understand that in order for them to show the fruits of maturation, they first need to feel safe, to have good attachments, to feel vulnerable, to feel their emotions, and then maturation will come and change the behavior. And so the idea here, similarly to the intuition of a gardener, the gardener knows that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which the flower grows and not the flower itself. And so our role as adults is to scaffold and to orchestrate, to compensate for the student in order to be successful, to be able to shield them from overstimulation and overwhelm, to be able to safeguard them from getting themselves into trouble, to be able to help soften some of their defenses, to come alongside their emotions, to help them co-regulate. So we understand that self-regulation is something that will come, but with time. And so short-term, what they need is co-regulation. And of course, to be able to protect the vulnerability and to preserve the working attachments that are happening there. The other piece that's really important to keep in mind, and that's the philosophy at the root of the Nurturing Support Center, is prevention. It's not about waiting for the student to get into crisis. It's not about addressing them when they're not accessible, when they're disengaged, when they're not receptive, and so forth. In order for them to be successful, it needs to happen in time of prevention, when they're in a good headspace, when they're feeling safe, when there's good structure and predictability, when we are working at things, taking risks, when they're leaning onto the adult, and that they are open and ready and capable of tackling struggles that in any other circumstance they couldn't. The other piece too, and I kind of already alluded to it, is keeping in mind the 4 basic needs. And so attachment is the preeminent need. No child, no adolescent will focus on growth if they're not feeling safe in their good working attachments. Sense of security, not just attachment security, but also in terms of the brain not being overwhelmed, in terms of the emotions, having space to feel your emotions, and having space for play. I mentioned play earlier, and we're going to talk about that more closely when I get into the pictures of the Nurturing Support Center. But the importance of having space to try out things without real repercussions. So I'm not talking about play in the sense of playing with dolls. I'm talking about being in the play mode, where students can try out things, can make mistakes, can take risks of things that they're afraid of trying in real life, because when we're doing it not for real, there aren't true repercussions. And so the Nurturing Support Center is that perfect practice ground in order for students to try out things that they would never even try to dare to do in the classroom. And of course, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but being able to compensate for the immaturity, make space for that, and so forth. And so I'll just move forward to the what, because I really want to make sure that we have enough time in order to take a look at the pictures, and that you could have a better sense of what a Nurturing Support Center is and what it does. And so I did show you quickly before the link to the page on our website. So you've got it here on the handout. You can click and get to it directly. This is the link to the recording that's off of the same page. You could get to the recording directly here. And so what's different of a Nurturing Support Center compared to any other space that is in the school is the fact that every single thing has been thought through. There's a philosophy that comes with the Nurturing Support Center. The room has been set up with intentions, with specific intentions. The materials have been chosen, again, with specific intentions. The adults receive a training that goes along with that. And so there's a whole bit there in terms of investment, in terms of time, in terms of training, in terms of philosophy. And this is what makes the Nurturing Support Center different from any other space, any other Oasis room. The other piece I should mention as well that's really central for the Nurturing Support Center is the academic piece. And so there's an expectation that in the Nurturing Support Center, it's not just a place where students go and take a break, or where students go to calm down or to release emotions. There is a section that is dedicated to academics. It's almost like a resource room, a mini resource room built into the Nurturing Support Center. So students can go there when they need to focus on individual work and can't do it in the classroom. Students can go there to be able to work on some academics that they're behind on, and so forth. And there's resource materials that are available in this space. Some of the Nurturing Support Centers have hired a part-time resource teacher to be part of the Nurturing Support Center to help in that way. But it's not meant to be just academics only. It's part of it, but the other piece is to focus on emotions, focus on the sensory, focus on the safety, focusing on expressing emotions and so forth. So we'll really walk this through. The clientele of the students that often come to a Nurturing Support Center are a variety of different clientele. And so it could be a child who's highly sensitive, a child who's easily overwhelmed, that struggles to manage big emotions, that has difficult family situations in that moment, and that's taken over their capacity to be available for learning, that they're struggling in unstructured times. Please know that the Nurturing Support Center is meant to be open all day. And so it's not just during class time, also during recess and lunch and so forth, can the Nurturing Support Center be available for those students that have a hard time being outdoors, that need more structure and more predictability. Here's a quick picture of what a Nurturing Support Center could look like at the elementary. So this is one at Cedar Street Elementary at Riverside School Board. This one is a whole classroom size Nurturing Support Center. Same thing with this second picture, which is at St. Lambert Elementary at Riverside School Board. Those two are from Riverside because the center is housed at Riverside. And when we initially started this initiative 6 years ago, we started with local schools at this board in order to set these up and to try different things. But please know that ever since these first Nurturing Support Centers have been founded 6 years ago, I now have Nurturing Support Centers in many different boards. There's some at Western Quebec, there's some at Central Quebec, Eastern Townships, New Frontiers, Riverside, of course, and I'm not naming them all. My apologies if I'm not naming your board and you have some there, but many boards, if not all, have some forms of Nurturing Support Centers. Not all of them have a size this big. This is a full classroom size. I have some that are half the size. I have some that are a quarter of the size. Honestly, it doesn't really matter the size. I mean, the bigger, the more sections we can have. But I've seen very well-functioning Nurturing Support Center with a quarter size room of this space. Now, one thing that I really want to caution on is that a Nurturing Support Center is not meant to be the end-all be-all. A Nurturing Support Center is supposed to be one support measure out of all of the support measures to be put in place in the classroom and in the school to support students. And so, of course, there should be best tier 1 practices for all in the classroom. There should be some targeted practices for those that are struggling. And then we're looking at tier 3, more individualized supports for those few students that struggle, beyond, beyond what other students would be struggling with. And so the Nurturing Support Center is available for students at tier 2, but especially at tier 3. And by the way, if you're curious to know more about the pyramid of intervention, there's a section on our website underneath projects. I think it was right above the Nurturing Support Center where I talk about the pyramid of intervention. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. And so the key elements for a well-functioning nurturing support center is to have caring adults. And not just nice adults. Yes, it needs to be adults that have the lead. Yes, it needs to be adults that are able to put structure and parameters, but it's adults who have good training that understand trauma and understand sensory overload and so forth, and that are able to be strategic in the way that they support students when they're struggling in that moment. In terms of having sections that are calm, and so it's not meant to be that every section is about being quiet. There are some sections in the Nurturing Support Center where students can let it out, where students can be active and so forth, but there are other sections where it's all about cocooning, it's all about feeling safe, it's all about being able to find that place where you can kind of center yourself. So important to have structured predictability. And of course, this, I mean, most teachers, if not all, really kind of think this through when they're setting up their classroom. And so this is a good practice to be put in place as well in the Nurturing Support Center. Having opportunities where students can talk, and it says here talk, but some students don't really want to talk, but they want to feel accompanied. And so could there be a variety of different mediums for whom students can be accompanied, even if they don't want to talk about it? I mentioned academic support, having tools and so forth. And so part of part of the supports to put in place in the Nurturing Support Center are things that are scheduled. And so I mentioned before the importance of prevention. We're not waiting for students to get disorganized before they come to the Nurturing Support Center. The Nurturing Support Center needs to be also utilized when it's scheduled in, when it's done preventatively. So looking at for the student to come in to see the adult who's there to do a check-in, to be able to, if they can't handle a certain class, that they maybe take a break in the Nurturing Support Center because they can only be in the class for that subject area for, let's say, half an hour, half of the time of the class. That maybe during lunch or recess, they can't handle being out there outside in the schoolyard every day of the week. Maybe they need certain days of the week where they have an activity that's more structured with an adult. And so, yes, scheduled, but of course, understanding the clientele, there's a big portion, that is also unscheduled. And so sometimes when there's a substitute teacher for some of these students who can't handle having a substitute teacher, the Nurturing Support Center can be a good alternative. When there's a home situation that's challenging, where there's been a divorce, there's been a death, there's been any type of difficult situation, that maybe that student needs an extra little something in order to feel well surrounded, to be at rest in moments and so forth. I've had some students that have a hard time sleeping at night, that have nightmares, and sometimes will come to the Nurturing Support Center for a nap. When teachers determine that the student needs a break, and so you see that the student is getting completely disorganized, that we've tried other things in the classroom and it's just not enough, they could have a break card to go to the Nurturing Support Center. Now, I need to mention here, part of the philosophy of the Nurturing Support Center, the NSC is not meant to be a reward room, and it's not meant to be a punishment room either. And so students go there because they need it, not because they deserve it, not because they've been punished and that's where they need to go to learn from their mistakes. It is meant to be, if after everything that I've kind of put forward there in terms of the brain and how things get destabilized and so forth, students go there because they need to go there, because they need a quiet space to work, or because they're upset emotionally. And so the exact use of the Nurturing Support Center will be determined specifically for each student. And so not all students go to the Nurturing Support Center for the same reasons. Some go more scheduled, some go more, upon need, some go every day, some go once a week. This is something that is determined by the Nurturing Support Center team. And so the team is made up of the support staff that is assigned to the space. Administrators need to be involved with this space. not just in terms of the setting up of the space, but also in terms of ongoing communication and team meetings. Professionals and consultants that might be involved with the space, the teachers and resource teacher, so teachers that are involved with some of the different students, parents perhaps might be part of the conversation, and of course the student, depending on their age and maturation and capacity to be part of this conversation. And so they too would be part of the conversation as to how does a nurturing support center best benefit them. And so in terms of the different sections, there's a lot of different sections. So I'm naming them all here. These are sections that are, if they were to all be put, this would be a whole classroom size space where there's an entry area, there's a check-in corner where there could be private conversations to be had, there's cocooning calming sections, there's a space for sensory materials, there's a section for physical movement, there's some workspaces with academic resources. There would also be some individual nooks for students to be able to focus on individual work and where they have their own, the supplies are available. Having some reading material with activities, having emotional intervention materials, having a building and creating section, perhaps a Lego wall, where students can, with their creativity, put out there their emotions through different arts and crafts mediums and building and creating mediums. Having access to some fine motor activities, a puzzle table perhaps, and where there would be, ideally, if there's enough space, a kitchen area with snacks. And this is oftentimes used during recess and lunch. So just quickly to get, and I'm sorry the picture is a bit small here, but to give you an idea, you can really see that every section has been divided with a different purpose. So you would have a reading area in one corner, a movement area in the other corner. There's an entry that's there to welcome students. There's a group for work, academic work section. So it's meant to be, each section has its own dedication and its own purpose. So if I were to show you pictures, just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. So this is the Nurturing Support Center at Cedar Street, where when you come in, there's a sensory corner right away at the entrance. And we oftentimes recommend for the Nurturing Support Center to have a poster to not just welcome students, but if the adult is occupied with other kids, that then the student can see what are my options while I'm waiting for the adult to come and see me, where can I go? So just to look at it a bit closer, it could be that the student can go in cocoon, or the student could go work on a puzzle, or they could go work on some Legos, whatever it is that they'll be doing in that moment until the adult is made available. Now, once the adult is available, one of the most needed and necessary types of strategies in the Nurturing Support Center is the check-in. Students are scheduled for those check-ins. Those, for some students, can happen, let's say, every morning or after every transition. And so the student goes there to check in with their significant adult before they go to class, just to make sure that they have the materials, that they're not completely destabilized by going outside in the schoolyard, and just making sure that they're ready and available to learn. And so, and if they're not ready and available, then the technician who works in the space might keep them 5 more minutes just to kind of recenter them before they send them off. And so I mentioned having a sensory corner, and so you could see that there's a variety of different materials, and all of the different types of categories of materials. We always recommend to have a variety of things because each child has their own bent, has their own needs, and so you want to make sure that you're able to cater to a variety of different needs. In terms of the cocoon area, depending on, these are in 3 different schools, and again, you can be creative where you don't need to necessarily purchase material. You could see here that they use the desk in order to create a cocooning section, and they just Velcroed on a piece of material so the student can kind of go hide underneath. Not all students will gravitate towards the cocoon area, but many will. And so it's a good thing to have. For those who don't want to cocoon, but want to have a calming space, could go to a really comfy chair or good bean bags on the floor, or some schools I've seen have an egg chair where they're able to close the front, and that gives them a bit of privacy. And so that could be another way in order to have that cocooning calming effect. In terms of movement, I mentioned that there was a section for movement. Some of the schools have a curtain that they're able to close off that section and have different materials. This is a, whatchamacallit, a target, a Velcro, a target board. And you can't see it inside there because the curtain's halfway closed, but it's there on the wall. And so the idea is to provide for students different outlets where they can let it out. Now, if you have a student that is in complete crisis, and that if we were to bring them in the Nurturing Support Center and will completely destroy the place, part of the recommendations, if you have the space in your school, is to have an additional corner, not in the actual space, but somewhere near it, called an emotions room, where students can go and just rip it out and just let it out. And there's some materials, not too many. I've got a link there so you can go and visit for more information, where they're able to scream and kick and throw, and it's done safely in that space because it's contained. Children get to also protect their dignity because others don't see them do this or hear them do this. And once they're in a place where they've let it out and that they're able to find their calm after the release, then they can come back to the Nurturing Support Center and do any other activity. So it's a good idea for those schools that have very explosive kids. And if you have an extra corner, it might be a good idea to have an emotions room on top of the Nurturing Support Center. Now, one thing that's really important is not just to have students let it out. It's important after they've let it out to be able to talk about what happened, talk about emotions, build emotional literacy, talk about tools that students could be using in order to help themselves manage some of these big feelings, or to help them move through that wave of emotion. And so we have all sorts of materials that we've built. The Center of Excellence for Behavior Management have built these materials. They're available on our website. So if you go onto the resource section, you would find things like, for example, the emotions folder. And so we've got a video capsule on how to assemble it and on how to use it. And where we talk about emotions, we talk about what's not working that has brought forward these emotions and what could be the tools to help you release those emotions. Another portion that is tied into the Nurturing Support Center is having an individual bin. And in that individual bin, students might have some cards on emotion and might have their tools to help them manage their emotions, which is called on a board, which is called a personal choice board. And so this would be put in their bins. And I'm not saying that in a Nurturing Support Center, every student that comes in should have a bin. What I'm saying is that your top frequent students that come in on a regular basis, those students would benefit from having a bin to their name with materials in there that they have selected along with you that are helping them not just with academics, but helping them with their emotions, helping them to be able to recenter themselves. There might be some sensory material in there and so forth. And what's great about the bin is that the student can take it back and forth to different spaces. Another corner could be, I mentioned before, the building and creating area, where the student has access to different mediums, whether it's yarn material, construction material, fine motor material, doing individual projects or community projects. And this is there to help them have a medium to release their emotions, because some students will go to the movement corner to let it out, but other students, actually for them, it's more beneficial to be able to do this through, I don't know, building a tower block with Legos and then breaking it down, or to be knitting and corking, or to be doing some sort of fine motor activity. And that really helps them to kind of channel that energy. And so, you know, if ever you don't have a big enough space and you have, let's say, a quarter of a classroom size space, that you don't need to have an actual corner dedicated to building and creating, but you could have bins that students would have access to with some materials available. And so here are other examples with puzzling, with fine motor activities, with perhaps yarn and being able to do corking and knitting. And so those two are things that are really beneficial, not just to help channel some of the emotions, but to help find the calm, finding rhythm, and so forth. In terms of literature, children's books. And so in this corner, they were able to create a whole section dedicated to books. But again, if you just have a shelf where you've got books available with some activities to go with it. These again are available on our website. We have like our top 10 favorites of books to include into your Nurturing Support Center along with activities. In terms of the academic resources and so forth, I do have some resources on our website, but this is something that could be worked on together in collaboration with your resource teacher in your school, where you could have a corner that's dedicated to FSL and ELA, and you could have a corner that's dedicated to math, where you could have some visual aids and you can have different types of materials to help students. And not just to have some learning material, but also to have a variety of different corners where students can either have, like a private nook where they're able to focus, and also thinking about flexible seating. Oftentimes those students that have a hard time sitting still, that get up a lot, that walk around a lot, not saying again that you should have all of these, but it could be that you have a variety of a few of them and that you try these out with the students. And these are good as much for elementary as they are for high school. And once students are taught how to use these properly, then these can be reutilized back into the classroom, but they're meant to be introduced in the Nurturing Support Center. Now, because I may have some audience today that are high school geared, I have a few pictures for high school. I just wanted to give you a visual so you can see what it could look like at the high school. So this is the entryway of one of the Nurturing Support Centers at the high school, where students can go and sit and wait for the adult. Here, there could be individual bins that are put into the shelving that is there. Then once you come in, you have different sections for working. You can see that there's natural dividers in order to divide the room into sections. You could see that there's also quiet areas that are put together. And oftentimes at the high school, where sometimes students really get disorganized, is a locker area. So I've also seen in the Nurturing Support Center at the high school, where some students will go to the NSC to use the locker there instead of using the lockers in the hallway. And so that could be a good place for them to be able to benefit from the Nurturing Support Center. Now, part of the Nurturing Support Center's philosophy is not just in terms of the setup of the room and the materials, but also in terms of collaborative approach from whomever's working in the Nurturing Support Center to the classroom. So there's communication happening, there are meetings that are happening to discuss students, there's documentation that has been created to help support students, where we're able to put in there what are the measures that we've put in place in the NSC for that student. And from month to month, what are we working on? So what's the intervention plan? What are the measures that we've put in place? Are there new challenges where we need to put in additional other measures that we didn't need to put before the month before? And so the idea here is that there's an ongoing, continuous kind of collaboration and communication between the teachers and the people from the Nurturing Support Center, the administration, and that there's documentation, that we're documenting what's being done and what is successful, what's not working, let's reflect on it. And there's PD that comes with that as well. And so some of the conditions for success is not just having the physical space, not just equipping the room, but that there's a common philosophy and an understanding of the mandate of the Nurturing Support Center. That there's a buy-in from the staff and administration where there's some commitment and there's some training. And so part of that is on our website. We do have some video recordings. We have a book. I actually have it here on my desk. I'll show it for those that are not aware of this book. The Reclaiming Our Students is a book that is a wonderful purchase. And I use chapters from this book all the time. I actually just this morning had a training with 2 Nurturing Support Centers at the high school at Western Quebec. And we were going through the chapter on the bossy student and the bully. And so part of it is the PD, and I make myself available when I can. Please know that I'm the only one running right now the Center of Excellence for the whole province. So it's difficult for me to do PD with everybody. What I invite you to do is to speak to your administrator, bring this forward to the Director of Complementary Services or Ed Services at your board, and through me, that maybe we could try and find a way to set up where there's a few schools where we could do a common PD together. And of course, having assigned staffing is inevitable. You cannot have this space without full-time staffing involved. I've had schools that haven't had enough resources where they've rotated 2 adults, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be a one person full-time available. It would be okay to have a rotation of a few staff, but not more than 2. And so I invite you to go and take a look at the website, as I mentioned, for more information. I see that there's questions in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing because we've got like only 2 minutes. I'm sorry, I speak a lot. Just want to see if I can answer maybe a question or two before we.
Catherine,
yeah.
One question that came up a few times is, who is the resource in that room? Is it usually a technician?
It's a terrific question. By the way, I just put back the handout in the chat in case not everybody got it. The main person who's hired for the Nurturing Support Center is a special education technician. So it's meant to be a tech who is the main person running the space, because remember that we're talking about kids with behavior, and there needs to be a whole emotional behavioral component in the support services. But there can be a part-time, like 5% part-time resource teacher that could be involved to help and support with the academic piece. So that's the other portion as well. It could not be a attendant or aide or préposé. It has to be a technician. I've seen some schools where they've hired somebody that has a higher training, like a readaptation officer or something like that, and that's just fine too. But it could be all right to have a spec ed tech. Oh, and somebody asked me about the reclaiming our students. So reclaiming our students, I'll write it into the chat, is by Hannah Beach and Tamara, Right, Jack. Voila. So that's the book right here. That's what it looks like. So it's Hannah Beach and Tamara Stryjak. It's not available in French just yet. It's available just in English for now. But the French version is, they're working on it. They're doing a translation. What else?
There was a question about the ratio. So in a large school, whether you would recommend more than one nurturing center. So the example given was 850 students in a school.
So I have right now at one of the high schools I'm working with at Western Quebec that they have about that size of school. And the Nurturing Support Center, they have limited it to a certain clientele. You cannot, it's impossible, even in a smaller school, it's impossible to offer this service to all students. It is supposed to be primarily for Tier 3 students. And if there is space, then you could open it up to some Tier 2 students, but it's meant to be for Tier 3. Students that have a history of trauma, students that have explosive behavior, students that have emotional regulation issues, that need that extra nurturing support and so forth. That is your main clientele. Now, you're never, depending on the size of the room, so if you have a class size room, you're never supposed to have more than a handful of kids at a time in that space. Because the second that you have too many kids, then you lose the essence of the calmness and the nurturing. And so you're meant, and some of the nurturing support centers that are bigger with more kids, like that one I'm mentioning at the high school, they have 2 staff. They hired 2 full-time staff for that room. And so they were able to divide themselves among the kids. But like during lunch, let's say you want to do a sheltered lunch, you never want to have more than 10 kids during lunch in that space, because then you completely lose the ambiance and the energy and the essence of the room. What else? Do we need to request an NSC at our board in order to have staff for this room? Okay, so just so you know, a lot of the boards, the way that they were able to get the monies to purchase the material, to hire the staff, they have certain budget codes that they've been used in the last couple of years in terms of like supporting children with mental health and emotional well-being and so forth. There are measures that exist. There are envelopes at the discretionary of the schools that are given in order to purchase materials and to support students in that fashion. And so I know that a lot of the schools took advantage of that measure in order to get to buy the materials and such. Now, in order to request for an NSC, you don't need me to put together a nurturing support center. I'm not involved in every single nurturing support center out there in Quebec. And so it's a question of having admin on board. Minimally, admin need to be in the loop. They need to take charge of it because there's a funding portion, but there's also a hiring portion. So absolutely, admin need to be involved. And in terms of the PD, it would be good to go through student services or complementary services. Oh, I just realized we're past. Oh my goodness.
I was just going to say, I'm sorry, as really wonderful as this is, we're going to have to end the session.
I'm just going to put my email in the chat again. So if anybody has any questions, please just write to me. Here we go. So it's ckorah@rsb.qc.ca. So just write to me and I'll answer your questions. Thank you, everybody.